Hi knitting friends, Shaina Bilow here. In today's video, I'm going to demonstrate how to seam the shoulders and pick up stitches for the neck and armhole on the Peachy Keen dress. Let's get started. The first step is to seam the shoulders together. The size dress that I did here is the 6 to 9 month size, so I only have 5 stitches on the shoulder. I'm going to use the yarn that's attached to one of the shoulders to seam. So I start by going in right at the corner. I have my yarn on my tapestry needle. I start by going in right at the corner of one side of the shoulder and then up into the corner of the other. And then I'm going to grab a stitch that looks like a little letter A from that side and a stitch that looks like a little letter V from this side. A and V. So my tapestry needle here is going just below and just above the bind off edge, parallel to the seam, grabbing the stitches by diving underneath them to create a mattress stitch seam, just like so. I'm going to turn the dress around and repeat that on the other side. Now that the shoulders are seamed together, I have an armhole, I have another armhole, and I have a neck opening. We'll start with the armhole because that's a little easier. In this case, I'm going to demonstrate how to use a magic loop because the circumference of my armhole here is pretty small. I wouldn't be able to fit the stitches from the armhole onto, say, a 16-inch circular needle. It's much too small for that. And one could use double points here if you wanted to, but why not do a magic loop? So I have an extra long needle. I have my yarn for picking up. I am a continental knitter, so I'm going to hold the yarn in my left hand for continental knitting. Right here is the center of the underarm. I'm going to insert my needle into the very first stitch, the very first V, as in Victor, at the bottom of the underarm. And then I'm going to insert my needle into the next V. Here at the underarm, we had done some bind-offs for shaping. So anywhere that you have a bound-off stitch, you will have a little letter V under the bind-off. That's where we were seaming before. So we're going to insert the needle into the V, wrap the yarn around the needle as though you're knitting. Hang on to it as you bring it through to the front. All right, then I'm going to go up the side of the armhole until I get to the shoulder seam. And when I do this, I'm now going into one line of stitches. They look kind of like teardrops or little letter A's. I'm going to skip this big one here at the turn where my stitch went from a bind off to a row. I'm skipping the big one. It only makes it bigger if you go in there. And I'm going to pick up 1, 2, 3, and skip a space. So I go into this stitch, pick up. Go into the next stitch, pick up. Go into the following third stitch, pick up. Now I skip this one. So I'm going to switch over to English style picking up just to demonstrate. The idea with picking up on rows is that you want to leave a little bit of space every 4 stitches or so because the stitch gauge does not match row gauge in any knitting. So you want to build in a little bit of space between your stitches so that you don't have a ruffly edging. So I am picking up 3 stitches, 1 for each hole. Oop, I skipped a hole. So I'm picking up 3 stitches and then in every row and then skipping a row. So as I do that, I'm picking up 3 stitches for every 4 rows. I find that that's a pretty standard or safe ratio for picking up. So I'm going right up here to the top, to the seam, Once I get to the seam, I'm going to hop to the other side of the seam and start going down this stitch here on the edge with that same ratio until I get to the center of the underarm, or to where the bind off stitches are. So 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to skip a row. And already I feel the stitches becoming a little tight on this straight section of the needle. So after I pick up my next stitch, all of the stitches in this circle are being pulled into a straight line, so they're tensing up. I'm going to move to the halfway point, my seam, and pull a bunch of cord out from my circular needle here. All right, so I've got a big amount of cord right here, and I'm going to slide these stitches back up onto the needle. So I have my first half of my stitches sitting on the cord, and that gives me enough flexibility right here that I can continue picking up down the other side of the armhole here. So 3 stitches, skip a row. So 1, 2, 3, and skip. 1, 2, 3. And I would normally skip this one. However, the one after that is that big gap that is that looks like the one on the other side. So I'm actually going to pick up in that 4th one just in this instance, because then I'm skipping this space, and now I'm going into these V's that are just below the bind off stitches. So V, jump down here to get this V by that bind off, and then I have one more right here. So now I have my stitches picked up for the armhole here. I have half of my stitches resting on the cord of the big circular needle or long circular needle, and I have half of the stitches resting on the needle. I'm now going to join the armhole in the round by sliding up the first stitch that I picked up, that half of the stitches. Once I have those stitches in position ready for knitting, I'm then going to pull the other half of the stitches onto the cord. And you get this look here that's sort of like a bow tie. So sometimes, since this is called the magic loop, I like to think of this as maybe the bow tie a magician might wear. So that's what the look is that we're going for here, that we have half of our stitches active on the needle, the actual metal part or wood, whatever, the actual knitting needle portion of your circular needle, and the other half of your stitches on the cord. All right, so now I'm going to, for this pattern, purl across the first round. So I'm starting off by purling the first half of these stitches, the first half of the round that is presenting itself right here for me on these needles. Once I have that first half knit, my next step is to bring the next half up. So this half of the stitches were waiting patiently on the cord. I'm now going to bring them up to the needle because it's their turn to be knit. And since I need the flexibility, the point of the magic loop is to have flexibility on the two halves of your knitting, I'm going to slide the stitches that I just knit onto the middle of the cord, thereby making that little bow tie shape again. Now I'm ready to purl the second half of my stitches. There we go, the second half has been worked. And now I'm ready, in this instance, to bind off. Depends on what your pattern calls for, but for this specific dress, all that the armhole, neck, and other armhole require is pick up, purl a row, and then bind off knitwise. So I'm going to slide my waiting stitches up to the needle, the ones that had not been just worked, and the ones that had been worked now go onto the cord. So here we are. I'm now back at stitch number 1 again. This is the underarm of the dress, so I know I'm back at my beginning point. You could also put a marker there to be sure. And I'm going to begin binding off in the knit stitch. Certainly, if you are working a different pattern and using this video as a guide for your other pattern, work whatever you need to, whatever the pattern calls for, making sure that your magic loop stays in formation. So I still have my little bow ties on the side of the work. I have my active stitches on the needle and my inactive stitches, the second half, on the cord. This cord happens to be, I believe, 32 inches or 80 centimeters long. The longer the cord, the better. So at this point, I've bound off half of my stitches. I don't need to scoot them down now to the half because there's nothing left there to scoot down. So I'm just going to slide up my next group of stitches and begin the second half of the bind off with that remainder stitch from the first half. Because I am still working one whole round, even though the round was split over two halves of the needle. It's still one round. It's still one continuous round. All right, here we are, last stitch. I'm going to cut the yarn, leaving a little tail. Take the yarn onto my tapestry needle, and you'll notice there's a gap here between my last and my first stitch of the bind off. So I'm going to bridge that gap by taking the tapestry needle with the yarn on it and coming under the legs of the first bound off stitch, and then bringing the tapestry needle straight down the last bound off stitch, and that bridges that gap a bit. Then I will weave in these tails into this pickup edge by zigging and zagging the tail right under the ridge of the pickup. Once I've gone a little bit one direction, I come back in the other, give it a trim, and one armhole has been picked up and purled. Now I'll repeat that for the other armhole, and then we'll tackle the neck. All right, those little armholes have been knit, and they are so cute. Now we're ready to pick up for the neck. Before we begin, I just want to explain the concept of what we'll be doing here because it's very similar to what we did around the armhole. Anywhere that we have a bound off stitch, so a stitch sitting upright, we're going to pick up into the V that's just below the bound off stitch. And anytime we're working on the edge of the work where we have rows, we're going to be picking up in 3 rows and then skipping 1. 3 rows, skipping 1. We do that so that the fabric of our stitches matches the fabric of our rows, the size of our rows. All right, so let's begin at one of the shoulders. Here I'm on the left shoulder, the left as the child wears it. Again, I'm going to start off with my hand wrapped for continental knitting, but if you're an English knitter, certainly you would hold the yarn in your right hand instead. Right here at the shoulder seam, in that very first clean looking row of stitches, I'm going to insert my needle, wrap the yarn around like I'm knitting, and bring a stitch up. I do that again, and a third time in the next row. Then I skip a row. 1, 2, 3, and skip a row. And now here it starts to get a little interesting. 1, 2. If I were to go into this hole, it's really big. And our rule about holes is don't go to any space that's too large. It'll only make it larger. So instead, I'm now shifting over to my bound off stitches. I see one right here on the other side of that big hole. So I'm just jumping over that gap. I'm bridging that gap. Going into a stitch, going into a stitch, and now here I have another stitch. This is another interesting space where we split the neck into 2 sides. So I'm grabbing the stitch from this part of the bind off, and then I'm grabbing one from right here. We had the center neck bind off, and then we had 2 stitches bound off on the next row. So that was just, you're picking up the first of the 2 stitches bound off, and then you're picking up the first of those 14 stitches that were bound off. And in doing so, we are maintaining the alignment of those stitches in the pickup. So as long as we're picking up inside the stitch that looks like a little letter V, as in very lovely, we will have a nicely aligned pickup edge. All right, so here I'm at another big gap and another stair step. So I see this stitch right here. My next one is right here. I'm going to follow it up, pick up that stitch, follow this one up, pick up that stitch. And now I'm back again onto rows. So again, I skip the big hole and I pick up 1, 2, 3, and skip. 1, 2, 3, and skip. 1, and I am now at the shoulder seam, and I'm at the halfway point of my stitches. I've just picked up all the way around the neck. So actually what I'm going to do this time that I didn't do at the armhole, but I'm thinking ahead now, I'm moving all of the stitches onto the cord of the needle so that this needle here can start picking up the second half of my stitches. I say half, but what I really mean is the other side of the neck. All right, so 1, 2, 3, skip 1. 1, 2, 3, and now here I would normally skip this stitch here because that's my 4th row. However, the following row after it is that big hole. So I'm going to go into that 4th row there, but skip over the big hole. And then I'm picking up now in bound off stitches for the center of this neck. Whether it's the front or the back at this point, I'm not even sure. I think this might be the back of the neck. But all I ever do when I'm picking up stitches is I follow the look of the stitch. So if it's an upright stitch, one that's been bound off or cast on, I pick up in the V, and I pick up 1 stitch for every stitch. And if I'm looking at a row, I pick up, here we go, another stair step here, skip the big hole. If I'm looking at a row, I pick up 3 stitches in every 4 rows. So here we go, I'm back to rows, skip that big hole, go into this one, and we're picking up at that nice ratio of 3 to 4. So 3 stitches, 4 rows. And here we are back at the seam. Since I'm working this as a magic loop, I'm going to slide my stitches up. The first stitch that I picked up was here, so I want that to be the first stitch that I work. It's ready for me. I'm going to bring these stitches that I just picked up down, and I'm going to follow my pattern instructions, which in this case is purl 1 round and then bind off knitwise. The neckline is done. This is so cute. I just have a few tails to weave in, and then I'm going to give it a steam with my steamer and gift it. Give it to my friend who's about to have a little baby girl. I hope you learned a lot. Please subscribe for more tutorials, and happy knitting!